Welcome everyone and I'd like to welcome Professor Neil Gershenfeld from the MIT Center for Bits and Atoms, where he's the director. He's going to talk to us about some very interesting things and said that I should mention that computer science is probably the worst thing that has ever happened to either computers or science.
So that's what I want to talk about. This is a paper from a dear colleague at MIT, Seth Lloyd, who calculated the universe can do 10 to the 120 ops. I estimate we've done 10 to the 30 so far. So we can do that 10 to the 90 more times. And what I want to talk about is how we make those first few steps into the rest of the available ops in the universe. So I'm going to do this in steps from near to far. So one step in is connecting the internet to things. This is a paper I wrote with a student, Rafi Krikorian, who went on to create Twitter's platform, and Danny Cohen. I'm curious, how many of you know who Danny Cohen is? It's amazing. So Danny, this is a festschrift I did for him, and there's videos here. If you don't know Danny, go watch this. Before Danny, TCP and IP were the same thing. He was the person who said routing a packet and doing flow control are different things, layering the internet. You might have heard of Moses Chipfab, he started that. And you might have heard of VoIP, he started that. He's this sort of legendary figure within the creators of the internet, but outside of this group of people, nobody knows him. So connecting the internet to things. So I think this was the first thing called Internet of Things, this project with Rafi and Danny. A step after that is species-centric. I was talking with Diana Rees, an animal behaviorist, Vince Cerf, and Peter Gabriel about we are being species-centric in the internet. Peter was playing music with great apes, where this was a nursing mother, and what you're seeing is the first time she had a keyboard, a music keyboard, and then it's Peter playing in the background. Again, this is the first time she's seen a keyboard. So it goes on, but she's working out music theory on the fly. And Peter was so struck that playing with great apes, they're more responsive and thoughtful than most musicians he plays with. And we just didn't have the right devices to talk to them. And so it led to a very serious project to create an interspecies internet. And that's how I met Ben. And Ben Laurie has been helping with this project for cognitive animals to bring all the tools of the internet. So one step further in connecting digital and physical. Now, if we connect everything to the internet, it breaks a lot of assumptions of the internet. And so to do this for the plumbing, we've had to go back and revisit things like source routing, network coordinates, back pressure flow control, a lot of the assumptions in the internet that don't scale to this world of embedded devices in the plumbing. Step after that is that's all based on digital logic. The transistors we're using have analog degrees of freedom. And there's a kind of a false dichotomy between analog and digital. This is a chip company we spun off that solves digital problems, but in the state space of the analog system. So a digital system is like a hypercube, and computers stay on the corners. you can work in the space of the digital problem, but you can take shortcuts and go through the interior. And by using analog degrees of freedom to solve digital problems, you can have significant improvement in things like noise margin and power budgets and links, things like that. So that's Lyric Semiconductor that was bought by Analog Devices recently. So that's analog degrees of freedom. Then comes quantum degrees of freedom. So this is a project I did with a group that was the first implementation of a non-trivial quantum algorithm. This was implementing Grover's algorithm for search in the very early days of quantum computing. And this was done by using nuclear spin dynamics in molecules and then doing Hamiltonian engineering to program the spin-spin coupling and using the exquisite decoupling of the nucleus to store the quantum coherence. And so we got up to a few qubits with this, and then we developed a lot of the pulse sequence techniques that are now being used to scale superconducting and ion trap qubits. Limit right now is about 10 qubits in a maximally entangled state like I'm showing here. So next step in is using quantum degrees of freedom. But quantum mechanics can do much more than that. This was a paper where we showed you can compute cryptographic hash functions in the mesoscopic light scattering limit. That's the limit where you're coherent, but you scatter many times within the coherence limit. So for about a penny, you can allocate a terabit of random data that you can query with an optical hash function that has exactly the properties you think of as a hash function that's then beyond national technical means to falsify the token. So given that kind of richness, this is how a computer scientist classifies the world of computation. And to a physicist like me, it's really silly. In the world we live in, a patch of reality occupies space, it takes time to transit, it stores state, and you can interact. And that's all there is. That really is the only model of computation. That's reality. And everything else is this kind of pretend fiction that's erected on top of that. So you call this the central dogma of computing. You write a program, then you make an object code, then you make an executable, and then you make a processor, and they have nothing roughly to do with each other. So why do we do that? This is the building I work in. You can go from the building to the street, to the city, to the state, to the country. You zoom, it's hierarchical, but you don't choose to remap the geometry of the map at each level of the zoom. This is how I would portray the state of computing. In Metropolis, to use a computer is to be in the garden dancing up. And then somewhere in the basement, somebody is swinging the levers around to make something work, and you don't know who they are, and they're this mysterious people in the basement. And that's roughly what we've come to in computing. Now, why should you care? Well, if you look at something like Heartbleed, it's all about things that are supposed to be far apart up in the garden up top, actually being close together down in the basement. Things that are distant in computing space being nearby in physical space. And there's sort of no way to capture that notion that you're far about in computing space, but you're adjacent in physical space. So buffer overflows, all of that is about where it's like the Matrix, where you go from the red pill to the blue pill, or sorry, wrong order, from the blue pill to the red pill. Right at that boundary is where this stuff happens. Or, the biggest supercomputers are, the power of a city, and there's really, to this day, poor insights in how to program parallel computing, how to use multi-core programming well. And if you look at the numbers, this was a paper looking at if you view a computing device as information goes in and information goes out and power goes in and out, and you ask how much power you need thermodynamically to transform the information, we're about 7 orders of magnitude off from the logical work you need to map the bits to what the computer actually does. And again, because there's this remote abstraction with what we're doing compared to what the devices actually do. So I blame 2 people. I blame him, and the reason I blame him is the Turing machine, which was never meant to be an architecture, is very unphysical. And the mistake made in the Turing machine is the head is distinct from the tape, meaning the storage of information is distinct from the interaction of information. And if you go back to the physicist model of computation, storing a state and interacting a state are the same thing. They're not decomposable. But the model of computation is storing a state and interacting a state are unrelated resources. Your computer spends much more power refreshing the memory, which isn't considered computation because that's a different system from the one that does the interaction. So that's Turing's mistake. And I blame him. And I blame him for taking roughly Turing's architecture and turning it into a computer architecture, which is now what most of your careers have been spent in. But the important thing to know is, I didn't know von Neumann, but I worked closely with Marvin Minsky, so I could ask him what Johnny thought. And Johnny did a lot of profound things, and the von Neumann architecture wasn't one of them. He didn't consider it one. He didn't write on it as one of them. It's really only in one place. It's in this report, the draft report on the EDVAC, and it's a hack. The EDVAC was this pile of stuff that kind of barely worked, and he wrote this report on how to make the pile of stuff kind of work. And so what he's done is he's enshrined Turing's mistake in this architecture of these processing organs that are distinct, that's really only written in this memo on a pile of stuff that's long since obsolete. So in effect, when you sit down at a computer and you use a programming tool, you're carrying the baggage of this EDVAC with you. And von Neumann really never wrote about that or talked about it as a deep insight into computation. It's just a hack that we're decades past its due date that we've been living with. So what to do? This is a project where we looked at, could you take physics and respect it at all levels of description and computation? And so and there are about 20 antecedents to this. There's a whole very interesting parallel history from Maxwell to Szilard to Bennett and Landauer of sort of a parallel history of can we make computing look like physics. And so the idea is computing is geometry that takes time and space. And so that worked up to, we implemented the BLAS in high-performance computing in a model of computing where computation is asynchronous propagation through geometry. And so state lives in tokens that travel through the geometry, and it's hierarchical and modular. And so this is very much like the Google Maps Zoom now. You can fly from a program through all the levels of description into the physics and back out again, respecting time and space and geometry. And in a world like this, a lot of the things that are hard in computing get easy. You don't have to figure out how to make it parallel because everything happens everywhere all of the time. Everything runs as fast as the underlying medium, and things that are distant in computational space are distant in physical space. So it doesn't solve everything. There's a lot of work to come, but a lot of what's hard about computing gets easy if you respect time and space throughout the computation. And so I'm really coming to the conclusion that we should just do a do-over. We had a good few decades, but it's really a mistake that computing, software doesn't represent time and space. And not only is there no good reason to do it, it's the source of a lot of the problems. And you can do it. You can propagate time and space through computation, and it simplifies a lot of what's really hard about computing. So I'll argue for doing a do-over. This is things like building routing kernels in it that have all of these properties of building high-level programs as geometry, not code. And then you can design cells in this world where computation is geometry, where cells create and destroy cells. And so this is an exponential fan out of a program creating parts of a program. Now, I complained about von Neumann and Turing, but to be fair, at the end of their lives, both of them reached exactly this point. Turing ended by studying spatiotemporal pattern formation, and von Neumann ended in these not really quite published notes looking at how to make a machine that makes itself, so how to make a computer that can construct itself. Ultimately, he was interested in foundation of what is life. But they were looking at exactly these questions about how do you bring geometry back into the representation of computation. It was purely theoretical because you couldn't do it at the time, but they had just reached that point. But we can do it now. So this was a project with a student where we implemented this is high-speed video, universal computing in microfluidics. So this is a one-bit memory. A bit is a bubble. And it toggles. And then this is high-speed video these are logic gates, and so slowed way down, but where one bubble appears, it goes one way. When two bubbles appear, they interact and go both ways, and so one bubble can probe for the existence of another bubble. This is a ring oscillator. This is a synchronizer. These are all the elements you need to do universal digital logic, nonlinearity, gain, fan out. But now bits transport material as well as information. And so you can actually make physically reconfigurable computers. And if you know how to do digital logic, you then know how to program fluidic logic. And so what that's leading up to is really a third digital revolution. Shannon, if you haven't read it, wrote the best master's thesis ever. This was at MIT. And in his master's thesis, roughly he invented digital. It's a good thesis. What he showed is the universality of digital logic. He's very generous in crediting the lineage of Szilard and this whole path before him. But that was the master's thesis. And then what he went on to do at Bell Labs, one of the few things is threshold theorems. And so the real meaning of digital is a threshold theorem. And a threshold theorem, an easy way to see it is if I give you a token and there's an error rate, there's an error. If I give it to you 3 times and you majority vote, there's 3 ways to fail. 2 of them have to go wrong and there's 3 ways to fail. And then if you majority vote to the majority vote and then you recurse on that, what you find is the error rate is exponential in the word size. And that, as long as the noise is below a threshold, which is 2/3 in this case. And so that exponential is one of the only exponentials in all of engineering. For noise below a threshold, if I send you a symbol, the error rate to decode it goes down exponentially in the physical resources representing the symbol. So that's what digital means. An interesting historical lesson is that's what Shannon did at Bell Labs. Once removed, I didn't know him, but Bob Lucky was there, and he told me they spent about a decade fighting over whether the phone system should be analog or digital, because there was overhead to doing this digital stuff. And the good life lesson from that I learned from Bob Lucky is that the battle was won by death. The analog managers died, and the digital managers took over, and that's how we have digital communication. But the real meaning of digital is this threshold property. So then, this is what von Neumann did consider profound. He literally directly applied Shannon to a computation. So view a computation as a symbol communicating through the computer. And he showed you could compute reliably with an unreliable computing device by transporting a symbol that then has these coding properties. Just before he did that, Vannevar Bush at MIT made the last great analog computer, a room full of gears and pulleys that got swarthed with time. Von Neumann showed you can compute reliably with an unreliable computing device, which is then the base of what made computing possible. So those are the first 2 digital revolutions. At that same time, Norbert Wiener's servomechanism lab made the first numerically controlled milling machine. This was the Whirlwind computer as part of Project SAGE, which was an air defense computer, which was really the first large-scale real-time computer. And there was this epiphany that to make aircraft parts you couldn't make by hand, you could connect the real-time computer and turn the cranks on the machine. So you could date computer-controlled fabrication to 1952, but it doesn't belong on this slide. And it doesn't belong on the slide because the state is in the computer. On the machine, you just have metal whacking away at metal. Errors accumulate. There's no state in the system. The really interesting transition now to program reality is to actually code construction by putting information into materials. So a few years ago, I ran a meeting with the White House on this emerging science of fabrication. Again, it's not digital designs of physical things. It's how to actually put coding and computation into the construction of things across length scales. And there, at this site, there's videos and talks that show snapshots of that, and that's what I'm going to walk through now. In steps, it progresses from a computer controlling a machine like 1952 to the second step in is rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping machines. So rather than a rapid prototyping machine like the laser cutter that made our tags, you can do rapid prototyping of the rapid prototyping machine. This is a fun example. I'll show you. This video is a student, Nadia Peak, who's been working on using rapid prototyping tools to make modular construction kits of rapid prototyping tools. Audio up a little bit. And so what she's doing, audio, no, is cutting out parts with the rapid prototyping tool. Then the machine is stateless. It's a modular real-time network. And so you make machine modules. Each module is a physical object, but it's mirrored in a software object. So then when you connect the physical machine objects, you're also connecting the software objects and synthesizing a control system. And I'll talk at the end about a global lab network I run, and we sent these parts out to beginners in machine building all over the world, and they had a week to make a machine. And so this is what beginners did in a week with modular machine building kits. This was a Japanese or a Korean calligraphy machine. This was a 3D scanner. Coffee stirrer, marble light show, but this is a multi-axis hot wire cutter, more seriously, lathes. So all of that leads up to the idea that very close from now, rather than acquiring a rapid prototyping machine, the machine itself becomes hardware objects mirroring software objects, and it could be 3 or 4 or 5 axis or open or closed loop, but the machine is as flexible as the projects you make with the machine, and you do rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping machines. But the step after that is much more important, and that's think of Lego. A Lego brick, the tower you make is more accurate than the motor control of a child because you can detect and correct errors in the placement. You can join Lego bricks made out of dissimilar material. You don't need a ruler to place Lego because the local constraints give you the global system. And when you're done, you don't put Lego in the trash. You can reuse the components. And those are really exactly the lessons Shannon and von Neumann taught us, but now physically. So the next step is not cutting or depositing, but assembling. And so this is a micro assembler. Audio, please. What this does is it assembles bricks of, again, audio. So it has a feedstock of micro Lego bricks, and it just places them roughly and then snaps them together. And it does coded construction of 3D volumes made out of micro Lego. And so this is scaling Lego down to nanometers. The smallest bricks we've made are about 100 nanometers. And then with just a conducting and an insulating and a resistor brick, with 3 bricks, DigiKey stocks 500,000 resistor types that vary in form factor and value and current rating. We can make that with an inventory of 3 parts. A resistive, conducting, and insulating brick. If you then add semiconducting bricks, you can start to make logic and 3-dimensional electronics that's completely reversibly assembled. And then this is a really nice design tool a student, Amanda Gasai, designed to design electronics out of micro Lego. So this is parts of an RF matching network. So she's taking conducting and insulating bricks, defining hierarchical modules, then turning them into the actual geometry, analyzing the connectivity, modeling the physics, and then exporting a construction code to the assembler I showed you. And so these are all the building blocks of the analog to CAD, CAM, and machine control, but now for a world of discrete construction of electronic bricks. On a bigger length scale, 2 years ago, we showed you can make the world's highest performance ultralight material to make airplanes and space structures, not by having a tool the size of this room to make a carbon fiber part the size of this room, but by making little tiny carbon fiber loops and then linking them locally into cellular structures that you build globally. And so that lets you do stuff like, this is a wing made out of those parts where you can dial up and you make a wing that can change shape. And then this is a robot design where the last assembler I showed you was smaller than what it's building. Now is bigger than what it's building. Now this is a robot that's small compared to what it's building. So all it can do is add or remove a loop of carbon fiber and make a step forward or backwards. But by doing that locally, you can build global structures with that. And we're working very closely with the aerospace industry to make to essentially take out the whole $20 billion supply chain to make aerostructures and be able to directly assemble them. So from there, the next step, and this is where it starts to get really interesting, is this is design, schematic design for an assembler that assembles the assembler. So this is now an assembler of the digital materials. And when I say digital material, what I mean is a discrete set of parts reversibly linked with a discrete set of relative position and orientation. So you get these attributes. You can locally detect and correct errors. You can join dissimilar materials. Local geometry defines global geometry, and you can reuse the parts. And where this gets really interesting is this is a manipulator, a stage, a clamp. These are made out of the parts that they assemble. And so what we're working up towards is an exponential ring up of assemblers that can assemble assemblers out of the parts they're assembling. And it turns out for scaling, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, that's essential. You need assemblers assembling assemblers to scale. And then the final step down that path is this is now the inverse of protein folding. This is the math to turn a 1D code into a 3D shape based on local information. It's solving the Hamiltonian path problem that's NP complete, but you can cheat and subdivide by 2 spatially, and then you can decorate and just read it off. And so this lets you directly turn a 1D code into a 3D shape. One of the lead students on that, this is a segment of a really interesting robot he made to do that in an electromechanical system. This is based on an electropermanent actuator, which is a hard magnet biasing a soft magnet in a motor that gets high torque at low RPM with static holding. And I mention that just because this was Ara Kanayan, and if you've heard of Google's Project Ara, this is the Ara of Project Ara, and this is the mechanism used to put the modular phone together. But here now finally is the math of how to actually turn codes directly into 3-dimensional shapes. And what that leads up to is it looks an awful lot like biology, and not by accident. It's not that we're copying biology, but you can think about it as forward engineering, not reverse engineering biology. By doing sort of good engineering, we're figuring out why biology does what it does. So this is the ribosome. It's my favorite machine. It's the protein that makes proteins. Messenger RNA comes in. The mRNA has all the properties of a good modern code. tRNAs bring in the amino acids. The amino acids are exactly like molecular Lego. And then the ribosome iteratively assembles them. And so if you look at the numbers, chemical synthesis has an error rate of about a part in 100. The ribosome makes an error rate of about a part in 10 to the 4 because you can error check the tRNAs. And then DNA synthesis is more sensitive, so it expends a thermodynamic cost to do an extra step of error correction. And DNA copying has an error rate of 10 to the 8. And that's this exponential scaling. The exponential scaling that gives you exponential complexity, which in this case is U, comes from the ribosome isn't just a code describing a thing. The code is the thing. The code becomes the thing. It's coding discrete construction of error-coded materials. And it's not a new idea. I didn't think of that. It's a 4 billion-year-old idea. That's the evolutionary age of the ribosome, and it's the most conserved part of biology. But we're coming to appreciate that's the real deep meaning of digital fabrication. Again, it's not a computer controlling a machine. It's actually putting the codes into the materials. What's new now is we're ready to start building things that work like ribosomes, but in material systems that don't exist in biology, like high electron mobility electronics. Your full of these machines. This is how you smell, this is how your muscles work, this is how you think. All of those are made in codes from the ribosome. And the really amazing lesson is this. The ribosome assembles 20 amino acids, and they're completely unremarkable. They're just not special. One is basic, one is acidic, one is hydrophobic, one is hydrophilic. It's not the most hydrophobic, it's not the most hydrophilic, and it's not all the degrees. It's just an example of each. But with that basis set of 20 parts that's good enough, you can make all of this. And so it's an inventory of 20 parts. And I estimate we should be able to do all of modern technology with an inventory of 20 parts. With a conducting and an insulating brick, I can do PCBs. Instead of etching traces with layers with vias, I can assemble PCBs, and I showed you that already. And I can do the connectors, and I can do the wiring, and I can do the case. With one extra part, a resistive part, I can give you any resistance value. Then with lightly and heavily doped N and P-type semiconductors, I can give you logic, and we're doing prototype transistors. Then you want a ferromagnetic and a ferrimagnetic brick and a piezoelectric brick. And around 20 or so bricks, we should be able to reproduce just about all of modern technology in the same way that biology is based on 20 amino acids. Tom Khalil from the White House OSTP wrote a really interesting position piece on what does it take to bootstrap a civilization? What are the minimum building blocks? The way I like to describe this is you can't colonize space and bring luggage. So what are the minimum building blocks you need to go off into space and bootstrap a complete civilization? It's a very provocative question, but the work that's been done to date on this roughly looks like this. If you're not familiar with these, I adore these books by David Gingery. It's a series of books where you start with a charcoal and iron ore, and then you end with a machine shop. And so you make a furnace, and you melt the metal, and you work up through hand tools, and eventually get to a machine shop. And this has essentially been the model of how we colonize space. You reconstruct the whole Industrial Revolution. In biology, there's a mistaken historical notion, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is the idea that the embryo goes through all the stages of development up until the present. But we sort of enshrine that in technology, the assumption we need to recreate the Industrial Revolution to progress. And what's coming out of this work is a very different model. It's more like the birth of life, that you bootstrap a civilization in the same way life evolved, but now with inorganic as well as organic building blocks. And so stepping back now, there were mainframe computers, millions of dollars. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs inventing Unix. And what's important about this picture is this is when a computer went from a whole organization down to a work group, went from $1 million to $100,000 and then tens of thousands of dollars. So they could have a vision of Unix without having to get management buy-in. This is the Altair. And for people like me, the Altair was life-changing. It was the first personal computer. And the killer app for it when it came out was you would flip switches on the panel to load a program. You would run it, and then the binary lights would blink. And that was it. And it was life-changing. It was a whole generation was transformed because it wasn't useful, but it was personal. And then we get the PC. The PC, to be clear, is profound in that if any of you date back to programming a PDP, it wasn't a computer. There was a processor rack and a storage rack and I/O and cables, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you needed to get all this stuff working. What the PC did was put in here a graphics system and a storage system and an I/O system and a power conditioning system and a switch so you could flip it on as if it's a monolithic thing. So you understand that history. And the important lesson is the internet emerged roughly here, not after the iPhone. The internet emerged at the transition out of the PDP. So now let's look at the this one. 1952 first NC mill, millions of dollars. A research lab like mine at MIT has these $1 million tools. I'm going to tell you about these fab labs. These are like the mini computers. then using machines to make machines. They're not yet useful, but they do work. That's like the hobbyist computers. And I just spent about half an hour on the research roadmap to the replicator. The replicator we're now coming to appreciate is it's all about embodying computation in the materials. I had a very amusing discussion with William Shatner when he was writing his book about who was imitating who, and we couldn't tell. But the roadmap to the replicator is about embodying computation in materials. Now, we're about here right now. We're right at this transition, roughly from the mini computer to the hobbyist computer. And I got that when I had all of these machines, and it would take a lifetime to learn to use them. So I started teaching a class called How to Make Almost Anything. And that was aimed at just a few research students to learn to use the tools. And I was alarmed when hundreds of students showed up begging to take it. Then they would say, "This looks too useful. Are you allowed to teach it at MIT?" And they went on and they did projects integrating their skills. So the first year, one of the stars was Kelly, a sculptor with no technical background. This was her semester project.
Hi, I'm Kelly, and this is my screen body. Do you ever find yourself in a situation where you really have to scream, but you can't because you're at work, or you're in a classroom, or you're watching your children, or you're in any number of situations where it's just not permitted? Well, Screen Body is a portable space for screaming. When a user screams into Screen Body, their scream is silenced. But it is also recorded for later release, where, when, and how the user chooses.
This is a web browser for parrots. Parrots have the cognitive ability of a few-year-old child. They go crazy left home alone. This is an alarm clock you wrestle with and prove you're awake. This is a dress instrumented with sensors and spines that defends your personal space if somebody gets too close. And this was happening so consistently, I realized these students were answering a question I hadn't asked, which is the deep insight emerging is digital fabrication. But I hadn't asked, who cares? What's the purpose of digital fabrication? And the answer, the killer app for digital fabrication is personal fabrication, just like computing. So going back to the history, from the Whirlwind computer, for the first NC Mill, MIT made the TX series, which were among the first transistorized computers. The transistorized computers, the TX series, were commercialized as the DEC PDPs. PDPs were used to create the internet. Ken Olsen, head of DEC, famously said nobody needs a computer in the home. And DEC is twice over bankrupt. DEC bought by Compaq, bought by HP. Wang, Prime, Data General, DEC, the whole computer industry was at Route 128. They all died when the PC came. The organizational lesson is it didn't matter what you did with organizational change, they were just all doomed. They all got the PC wrong. But you don't have a PC at home to do inventory and payroll. You have it to do what makes you, you. And so in the same sense, the point of all of these aren't to reproduce what you can buy at Walmart. It's to make what you can't buy at Walmart. It's personal production for a market of one person. PCs didn't make mainframes obsolete. There's crucial functions for that. That's a lot of what you do for a living. But there's this, you interact with computing close to the users, and then it goes up through the hierarchy, and the same thing is true for fabrication. And so around that period, an accident happened. Congress passed a rule of government agencies have to measure social impact. I had gotten a giant NSF grant to buy. I wrote a grant to say I want one of every machine to make anything, and sort of got NSF on a good day. But this rule was passed, GIPRA, and so NSF turned to big grantees and said, you have to measure social impact. I had no idea how to do that, but I thought the machines were cool. And so inspired by that historical analogy, it's going to be about 20 years to make the replicator. And understand a 3D printer is remote from that. The replicator builds complete functional systems from atoms on up. But today you can emulate it with about 2 tons and $100,000. So here, I have a picture here. This lab is in Vestmannaeyjar. If you've seen the pictures of a town being destroyed by a volcano in Iceland, it's this, but they're okay. And what's in here is 2 tons of stuff, $100,000. It includes 3D printing and scanning, precision machining, laser cutting, large format machining, composite layup, surface mount rework, embedded programming, scanning, all of that. And if you view all of that as a machine, data comes in and you can make anything, or objects come in and data comes out. And we set up one of those for NSF to check off this outreach box, and then we're going to go back to the lab and work. And at last count, we're about 1,000. Doubling time is a year and a half. They're in every part of the world. We have in war zones, in shanty towns, above the Arctic Circle. Functioning as a global network of fab labs, and it's exactly like the spread of the internet. The internet appeared to be a revolution, but on a log plot it went from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 hosts, and for a decade you could just plot that, and then it appeared suddenly something happened. In the same sense, these have been doubling for a decade, and it lets anybody make anything anywhere. And if you can do that, it fundamentally challenges a lot of assumptions. So work, you leave home to go to a place you don't want to be, doing something designed by somebody you don't know to make something for somebody you'll never see, to then go home and get money and get something that you want. What if you could just make what you want? Sort of the basic assumptions about money and work. It's not free, but if you remove all of those steps and remove it down to the incremental building blocks, it really changes what is money and what is work. This is the mayor of Barcelona. Barcelona has a fabulous design sense and 50% youth unemployment. A whole generation can't work. And so this is a project where they're putting these fab labs in every district of the city as part of urban infrastructure. The city provides electricity or clean water. This is now the means to create, rather than buying products made far away and sending trash to trash dumps, the city as part of urban infrastructure can create what it consumes. Similar to that is, this was a White House Maker Fair where the surface text is celebrating making, but the subtext is a lot of American manufacturing is Wang Prime and Data General and DEC and isn't going to survive this transition. The new jobs aren't coming back to the old factories. Then this is a project where we had bright kids in African villages coming and learning to do surface mount rework and embedded programming and three-dimensional parametric design that maybe not all of you know how to do. And so they would fall off a cliff. Where do you go from there? And so we started a program called the Fab Academy. In computing terms, you can think of MIT as a mainframe. You go there and get processed. And it works well. There was a calculation late last year that MIT is between Russia and Germany. It's the world's 8th economy for the businesses spun off. So it works well, but it's only a few thousand people. I don't like MOOCs, online classes. In computing terms, it's BitNet. It's time sharing. You're a terminal connected to this educational processor. What we're doing in this Fab Academy, initially teaching digital fabrication, is it's like the internet. Students have peers in work groups, in labs, with machines and mentors locally. Then we connect them by video and content sharing. So it's a global class, and there's this profound connection between communication, computation, fabrication, and engineering. The communication lets us talk at a distance. So if you, the computation lets us share information, and then the fabrication means once you have a basic set of tools, you can make anything else. So you can bring the campus to the student. The whole model of MIT is based on books are scarce, people are scarce, tools are scarce, space is scarce, and so you limit it to this few thousand people. Once you mix communication and computation with fabrication, you can then do this on a global scale. So we've been doing, right now we're running at about 100 sites in this global campus. A colleague, George Church, who's one of the leading geneticists, taught the second class in the sequence, which is how to grow almost anything, which is the recursion of you use a fab lab to make a bio lab, and then you learn to do biotechnology. And so really, the whole division of education, aid, industry, play, sort of we all separate them this way, but if anybody can make anything anywhere, it cuts across all of them. And the hardest thing in all of this, I thought, was the research I spent the first part of the talk on. That's been, in a sense, easy. That's humming along. What's been hard is we've had to invent completely new organizations. It just breaks what is aid, what is business, what is a school. And we've had to create a whole new set of organizations. It's a little bit like the emergence of the IETF and the IAB and the organizations and the birth of the internet. So if you think of this as an internet of real things, we've had to invent the kind of organizations for it. And in many ways, that's much harder than the technology. It's much harder. It's easy to find people to invent. It's much harder, sort of this nesting of people to invent invention in the organizations. So with that, there's background in all of these. And so that's a tour through very short-term to medium to long-term. What does it mean to finally get over the fiction that digital and physical are different and bring them together? And so with that, I'll thank you and take questions. Oh, good luck. So the question is, how does all this relate to the singularity? Sorry? So I have a problematical relationship with Ray Kurzweil because he drives me crazy. But, there's a but. He views me as marching lockstep to execute his roadmap, and then he proceeds to show me the graphs that anticipate every single thing I've ever done. So I don't, with that disclaimer, Ray I like. Having said that, he's careful and he does his homework. The word singularity has come to be attached to the sort of millennial cult that does fuzzy thinking and doesn't do the homework of Ray. And so, I think the best answer is this is a digital revolution like communication and computation, but now for fabrication. This one is going to be bigger because we're programming the world out here, not the world in there. But all of these end up being sigmoids. They're exponentials, and at some point the exponential becomes a sigmoid. And Ray has an argument for how you stack enough sigmoids and it eventually becomes an exponential of exponentials. But I expect this is going to be a sigmoid. It is scary. I think the most alarming part of all of this was a dinner I had at my house last week with the leaders of gene drives, and as well as critics. And so a gene drive is, nothing I've told you is scary compared to gene drives. A gene drive is, CRISPR-Cas9 is this amazing system that's like Emacs or VI for DNA. Think VI for DNA. You can just get in and change anything. It's amazing. It works beautifully. It's easy to use. The alarming thing you can do is, if you wanted to, say, get rid of malaria, you could try to breed a better mosquito that didn't have malaria and hope it would spread. Or you could put the edit to the genome of the mosquito that doesn't spread malaria, and in the genome put the machine, CRISPR-Cas9, such that you make mosquitoes with the machinery to modify the genome. And so every child mosquito has the machinery to modify the genome. And so you get an exponential ring up of spreading the machinery through the genome. And if you get it right, you get rid of malaria. And if you get it wrong, you kill all mosquitoes on Earth. And so the community of biologists has stepped back to say, wait a minute. So this is all related to germline modification, which is permanent change to a genome, and to say this is actually really scary. We can do this. We don't know how to manage it. If you actually did what I said, it's not quite that simple. There are countervailing forces, but it's roughly like that. And so the biologists are doing everything I told you, and we're part of collaborations. One of our collaborations is designing completely synthetic life. Another collaboration is recoding the genome to free up codons. And so we can do all of this, and when you make it self-reproducing, there it really is alarming. It's exciting but alarming. As soon as you go to these non-biological systems, it no longer can spread exponentially because it doesn't have the feedstock. That to spread exponentially, you need to source from the environment the feedstock. In the back? Yeah. Yep. So the question is democratizing access, how does it spread? Arguably, the first two revolutions were sort of fails in the rich get richer and they spread inequality. They've done good stuff, but as much bad stuff. To be clear, this Fab Lab story I ended with is not what I think. What I thought was to set up one lab and then go back to the lab, and this exponential growth is what the world thought. And so nobody's planning this. It's sort of lateral alignment of sites opting in. But something we have been seeing is all over the world, these labs are flourishing under the noses of places that have terrible racial tension and terrible economic disenfranchisement. And the labs are being driven, in a sense, they're elite, but democratically elite. They're being driven by bright, inventive people all over the world who don't fit, who are looking for opportunity. And so, let's see, there's a wonderful lab network in France. I was at a meeting of the elites in France, of like the heads of state and the heads of corporations, and it was crazy. I was speaking in a session of, is it possible to innovate in France, or should everybody leave and go to Silicon Valley? And that's the view from on top. But down in the trenches, there's this whole other generation just giving up on government and sort of creating this whole network from the bottom up. In the same sense, what's happening in Barcelona isn't Catalan separatism. They basically left Spain and left Europe because Brussels and Madrid aren't helping. And they're creating sort of this new notion of an economy. And so it's a real concern based on the last round. But what we have been seeing is this is really being driven by people being failed by the existing economy and inventing a new one. A really extreme example was one of these labs is on the Giza Plateau. During the Morsi riots, we called them worried. You called them concerned. Are you okay? And they kind of laughed and said, for the bright, inventive kids who have no interest in sectarian conflict, they took it as a day off to go to the lab and work, and they're just fine. And so let's go around for questions, but reproducing the history of PCs, all the people who should be worried about this aren't, because they think it's a toy. So it's coming in under the radar. So the question is, what is the role of quantum computing? There is a wonderful early period in quantum computing, when you maybe had to take off your shoes, but that was it to count the people doing it. Where to do quantum computing, you needed to know a lot about a lot of stuff and not fit. And there was nothing, this was pre-Shor's algorithm, there was nothing on offer. There was no big benefit. It was just this beautiful, odd thing. And what's important to know about that period is most of what was driving it was not trying to make faster computers. It was, you could view it as interesting, you can make computers out of quantum mechanics, or you could exactly view it as the opposite. Quantum mechanics is taught in the language of partial differential equations. Partial differential equations are the IT of 2 centuries ago. There's nothing fundamental about them. You could view computation as a much more fundamental description of nature, and the partial differential equations are a derived property of nature as a computer. And that's really what was driving a lot of the early work on quantum computing. And so now, fast forwarding, then went, to me, a very unhappy period where once things like Shor's algorithm came out, it became a make-work program for physicists, where whatever anybody was doing would say, I'm doing quantum computing. And we're now at a stage where much of the claims of quantum computing commercially are ridiculously overblown, and at heart it comes down to really get the power of a quantum computer, you need to be in a maximally entangled state, and the record for that still is around 10 qubits. But so far, the killer app for quantum computing is simulating other quantum systems. It's exponentially hard to simulate quantum mechanics, and beautiful work is being done to make universal quantum simulators that let you model atomic physics or transistor scaling. So using quantum computing to model quantum systems is a beautiful application. There's a really beautiful thing emerging of really revisiting the foundations of how we describe quantum mechanics. But technologically, I just don't see it as very important in our lifetime, because maintaining maximally entangled states significantly larger is exponentially difficult, and I just don't see any quick opportunities there. Yeah, so the question is, how do we get from can we do it to should we do it? Which is an important question as all this gets more alarming. So I do believe in history, and for essentially all of history, we've been on the verge of new things that are the end of life on Earth. And that's been consistent. And what's been consistent throughout history is sort of technology by itself isn't good or bad. People are good or bad. So a microcosm of your question is I've briefed rooms of intelligence analysts or army generals about all of this research. And when I get to the part at the end about 9-year-old African girls in rural villages doing surface mount rework, consistently, the room fractures down the middle. And so at a room full of army generals, half the room said, my God, we have to control this. But the other half of the room, they is not they. They is very finely divided. There are many theys. And the other half of the room says, are you kidding? The best thing we can possibly do is have 8-year-old African girls doing surface mount rework. That's at the root of just about everything. Or I was at a room full of intelligence analysts, and same thing. And there was one guy, his face was red, he was fuming. I'm on the hook to prevent unanticipated threats to our country, and you're telling me about 8-year-old girls making surface mount electronics in rural Africa? And the other part of the room, the intelligence analyst turned to that one and said, are you kidding? If ever there was something we should be paying attention to, it's exactly that. And so we have these at the Protestant Catholic boundary in Northern Ireland. We have them... Here, let me show you a picture. This is worth a minute. So this one is at the Israeli-Palestinian boundary in Israel. We have one at the Protestant Catholic boundary in Northern Ireland. We have one in Afghanistan. And what we find is these aren't used for bad things because doing bad things is a well-met market need. If you want to hurt somebody, there's great supply chains for it. These get used as an alternative to doing bad stuff. And so it's sort of, nobody's in charge. It's a lateral alignment, bottom-up answer, but it's kind of investing in the wisdom of ordinary people. And I think that's both kind of a trivial but a profound answer, that by democratizing access, sort of state actors already can do all of this stuff. By democratizing access, it sort of brings in, the insight of communities. And I think that's a really important part of it. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so sorry, let's see, there's one more thing I'll show you that's, I was at the UN for the largest gathering of heads of state ever. and this was a couple months ago. This was the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals roughly were rich white guys telling the world what it should do. This was kind of a do-over of the world figuring out what it wants to do. But the reason I was there was the White House was involved to try to present not just problems but solutions. And so the Millennium Development Goals are things like clean water or access to health care. And a surprising fraction of them rest on access to digital fabrication. So one of the things, we set up a pop-up lab at the UN, and it was this bright kid from Peru who's one of the Fab Lab leaders there. He grew up in the Amazon jungle, and as he describes it, when he grew up, you had three choices. You could be a farmer, a soldier, or a terrorist. You had to pick one of those. And so he's sending rapid prototyping tools up the Amazon for sustainable production in indigenous communities. And if you go across this checklist, I was with the person in charge of humanitarian relief for the UN, Baroness Amos, and I was speaking at a dinner, and she was really irritated because she wanted to deal with the problems of refugees, and I was talking about machines. She wanted to deal with the refugees don't have access to infrastructure, they don't have access to education, they don't have access to entertainment, and then this sort of light bulb went off, wait a minute, if you actually provide access to these tools, it gets at all of that. And so there is this pivot happening. You know, when we ran a lab at the UN, which was a wild experience bringing high-power lasers through security, you know, the diplomats were reacting like, wow, we don't see people like you here. And so your question is a good one. Nothing's really written yet about this. It's evolving. But if you think about notions like work, money, refugee, school, and think about breaking the bid-atom boundary, it really changes all of that. And it really means there's a sort of meta project of reinventing how we live, learn, work, and play. And so that's not just writing, it's really on the ground inventing what does that world look like. And so I think that's a good point to end on, and with that, I'll be happy to talk informally and invite you for all of this. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank Neil personally. That was really engaging and a little bit different than what we normally see, but the feedback that we've seen just here and online has been fantastic. So it was really great. One of our traditions for our keynote speakers